The very moment the 911 call was received, a relentless investigation began.
I said goodbye to my mama and Jamie since we never got the chance to. I was so used to you guys always being here to the point that I never once thought to imagine y'all not being here.
One that would span months, consume thousands of man-hours, and require the full weight of the local and federal law enforcement agency partnerships.
They were beloved, respected, and sleeping in their own bed when death came for them. But what chills me to the bone is who police say pulled the trigger. This isn't just another murder case. It's a story that will make you question everything you thought you knew about family, and it begins in the most ordinary of places. Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. Let's head to Georgia, a small, peaceful city where neighbors wave to each other from driveways. Church bells ring on Sunday mornings, and the loudest sounds on a weekday evening are usually cicadas. But in February of this year, that peace shattered like glass. In the still hours of the morning, inside a neat brick home on a quiet street, two people were shot to death while they slept. James and Kristen Brock were well known here, the kind of couple you'd see volunteering at the church picnic or stopping in the grocery store to ask how your kids were doing. People didn't just know their names, they knew their kindness, which is why the word murder and Brock in the same sentence felt almost absurd until flashing lights filled the night sky. That morning, the Carroll County Sheriff's Office responded to a distress call. Within minutes, their house was sealed off with yellow tape. Officers moved in, finding the Brocks in their bedroom, lifeless, both with fatal gunshot wounds. There were no signs of forced entry, no shattered glass, no busted locks. To the untrained eye, it looked almost too clean for a violent crime scene. And that's what disturbed detectives. In cases involving strangers, there's often chaos. Overturned furniture, signs of a break-in, frantic attempts to find valuables. But here, nothing seemed touched except the bed where James and Kristen lay. Whatever happened had been precise and personal. News spread fast in a small town. By noon, local social media was filled with posts. Disbelief, prayers, rumors. Parents clutched their children tighter, and somewhere in Carrollton, the person responsible for the killings was quietly watching the panic they'd created. This wasn't just a crime. It was a betrayal that cut to the core of a community. And as the investigation began, detectives faced a troubling question. If the killer didn't come from outside, had they been inside all along? James and Kristen Brock were the kind of couple people described with words like steady, trustworthy, and genuine. James, 42, had a warm, easygoing presence, the sort of man who could strike up a conversation with a stranger at the gas pump and have them laughing before they left. He worked hard, but everyone knew his real devotion was to his family. Kristen, 39, was his perfect match in so many ways. Soft-spoken but strong-willed, with a gift for making people feel seen. She was active in her church, quick to volunteer for community events, and fiercely protective of her children. Together, they raised a blended family. Kristen had an older daughter from a previous relationship, Sarah Grace Patrick, and together with James, she had a younger daughter, a bright, playful 6-year-old who adored her parents. On social media, the Brock's life looked almost idyllic. Family photos at the beach, holiday dinners surrounded by relatives, and James posting about how much comfort he found in his youngest daughter. On February 19th, just one day before the murders, James shared a Facebook post that friends would later find haunting. He wrote, "When I'm down and don't feel good, I find comfort in this little girl." The post included a picture of him smiling next to his youngest daughter. Within 24 hours of that post, both James and Kristen would be gone. To their friends and neighbors, the Brocks were pillars of stability, people you could count on. But detectives would soon learn that behind the walls of their Carrollton home, not everything was as picture-perfect as it seemed. This wasn't just about who James and Kristen were in life. It would become about who, in their circle, had the means, the opportunity, and the cold resolve to take them out of it. And as it turned out, the person police would accuse was someone the couple trusted completely. February 20th began like any other winter morning in Carrollton. The air was cool, the streets quiet. But inside the Brock home, silence had taken on a different weight. Just after dawn, a 911 call came in. The voice on the other end reported that James and Kristen Brock had been found unresponsive in their bedroom. The dispatcher's notes were brief but chilling. Gunshot wounds. No signs of life. When deputies arrived, they immediately noticed what wasn't there. No forced entry, no signs of a struggle, nothing stolen. The front door was intact. Windows were unbroken. Even the living room looked undisturbed, as if the couple had gone to bed in peace and never woke up. The bedroom told a darker story. Both James and Kristen were lying in bed, shot while they slept. Their position suggested they hadn't moved. They hadn't even had the chance to open their eyes and react. Investigators knew what that meant. Whoever pulled the trigger had been close enough to stand over them, aim, and fire without warning. The nature of the attack pointed to something deeply personal. Random burglars don't leave everything untouched. Opportunistic criminals don't execute people in their own bed and then vanish without taking valuables. This was the kind of precision and the kind of coldness that hinted the killer wasn't a stranger at all. News of the murders spread quickly through the community. Neighbors stood at the edge of their driveways, watching as police cars came and went. Some prayed, some cried, and all of them wondered, if someone could kill James and Kristen, who in this town was capable of that? The answer would take months to uncover, but even on that first day, there were details that made investigators pause. Details that would later seem obvious. But in the fog of a fresh crime scene, they were just the first flickers of suspicion. The 911 call that set everything in motion came from inside the Brock home, but not from a panicked neighbor or even a passerby. It was made by someone who lived there. The voice on the recording belonged to Sarah Grace Patrick, Kristen's 16-year-old daughter from a previous relationship. She told the dispatcher that her parents were unresponsive, that something was wrong, and that help was needed immediately. On the surface, it sounded like any other distressed family member calling for aid. But to seasoned investigators, certain things didn't quite fit. First, Sarah claimed she had been unaware of anything unusual until her younger half-sister, just 5 years old at the time, came to her and said something was wrong with Mommy and Daddy. That detail alone was hard to swallow. The murders had been committed with a firearm, and neighbors later told police they had heard what they thought might be gunshots. Yet somehow, the teenager in the same house hadn't noticed a thing until a child barely old enough to read came to get her. When deputies arrived, they found Sarah outside with her little sister, both bundled against the morning chill. The younger girl clung to a stuffed toy, wide-eyed, while Sarah kept her distance from the front door. Body cam footage, not yet released publicly, reportedly shows her demeanor as calm, almost too composed for someone who had just lost 2 people in such a brutal way. Inside, detectives began their preliminary sweep, asking Sarah basic questions. When had she last seen her parents alive? Had she noticed anything unusual overnight? Who else had keys to the house? Her answers were vague, almost rehearsed. At that moment, nothing directly linked Sarah to the crime. But the fact that she was one of only 2 people inside the home during the murders, and that the other was a 5-year-old, meant she would remain firmly on the investigators' radar from the very start. For seasoned investigators, no training can fully prepare you for the moment a child becomes your primary witness. That morning in Carrollton, it was the Brock's youngest daughter, just 6 years old now, but only 5 when it happened, who had stumbled into her parents' bedroom and found the unthinkable. The little girl's account was fragmented, filtered through the limited understanding of a child. She told officers that she went into the bedroom after waking up and finding the house strangely quiet. She had called for her mom and dad, but they didn't answer. The room was dim, the blankets pulled high, but something didn't look right. That's when she noticed the blood. Her instinct wasn't to call 911. She didn't even know how. Instead, she ran to her older sister's room. Sarah was the one with a phone, the one who could fix things. But Sarah didn't rush into the bedroom. Instead, she made the 911 call from a different part of the house. Investigators would later recall the way the little girl seemed confused by her sister's reaction. In her mind, finding their parents hurt should have meant screaming, running for help, trying to wake them. But instead, Sarah's calm demeanor left a gap between what the child expected and what actually happened. Forensic psychologists know that children this young often provide accidental truths, small throwaway comments that reveal inconsistencies. That morning, she mentioned that it was still dark when she heard something loud, like when Daddy fixes the fence. Detectives would file that detail away, knowing it could refer to the sound of gunfire. In those first hours, the little girl was whisked away to stay with relatives. She had no idea her words might someday help build a murder case. And she couldn't have known that her half-sister, the person she turned to for safety, would soon be accused of causing the nightmare she was trying to escape. In the days that followed, Carrollton tried to process what had happened. The Brocks' murders dominated local headlines, but despite the intense public interest, investigators were careful with what they revealed. From the outside, it looked like the case had momentum. Detectives were in and out of the Brock home. Crime scene techs combed through every inch of the property. Neighbors were interviewed, surveillance footage from nearby homes and businesses was collected, and the sheriff's office put out a call for tips. Kristen's father, devastated by the loss of his daughter and son-in-law, offered a $5,000 reward for information leading to an arrest. He told reporters from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution that whoever had committed this crime was cold-blooded. His words carried an urgency, a plea not just for justice, but for answers that would make sense of the senseless. But behind the scenes, leads were drying up. No one had seen suspicious vehicles in the neighborhood that night. There were no obvious enemies, no outstanding debts, no signs of a burglary gone wrong. Friends described James and Kristen as the least likely people to be targeted. Weeks passed, then months. Public attention began to drift, but investigators kept at it. The lack of forced entry nagged at them. It suggested the killer either had a key, was invited in, or was already inside. In many homicide investigations, momentum fades when the trail goes cold. But in this case, small pieces of evidence were quietly coming together. Forensic reports trickled in. Digital data was reviewed. And as they worked, detectives found themselves circling back to the same uncomfortable reality. The person responsible might not be an outsider at all. By the time summer arrived, investigators had more than suspicions. They had threads they believed would eventually weave into a rope strong enough to hold in court. They just had to wait for the right moment to pull it tight. Funerals in small towns are intimate affairs, the kind where the church fills with friends, neighbors, and even strangers who simply want to show respect. James and Kristen's memorial service was no different. Rows of pews were packed, the air thick with grief and the scent of fresh flowers. Among the mourners was Kristen's 16-year-old daughter, Sarah Grace Patrick. Dressed in black, she walked to the podium when it was her turn to speak. The congregation fell silent. Her voice was steady as she began. Although there's nothing we can do to bring them back, we still have control over how we treat people.
I said goodbye to my mama and Jamie since we never got the chance to. I was so used to you guys always being here to the point that I never once thought to imagine y'all not being here. I didn't have a single clue how much I needed y'all until now. For James, thank you for all the life lessons you taught me and for being the best bonus dad ever. Your heart will finally be healed in heaven and neither of y'all will be in any pain anymore. Although that gives me so much comfort, your fight was not supposed to end there. Although there's nothing we can do to bring them back, we still have control over how we treat people with us today. Therefore, when someone tries to tell you anything, no matter how important it could be, just listen, because you never know when it's somebody's time to go. You could say goodnight and wake up a few hours just to find out they aren't there, despite their joy and their love. So just listen and never take a hug or anyone or anything for granted and love with all that you have in you like they did.
It was the kind of sentiment you might expect from a grieving child, a call for kindness in the face of loss. But to some in the audience, there was something almost detached about her delivery. Others noticed how composed she seemed, how little her voice wavered. No one in that church knew what detectives were already considering behind closed doors. They didn't know that Sarah had been in the house that night. They didn't know investigators were quietly comparing her statements to physical evidence from the crime scene. And they certainly didn't know that months later she would be accused of killing the very people she was eulogizing. In hindsight, the moment feels chilling. Standing in front of her community, Sarah spoke about love and empathy while, according to law enforcement, concealing the darkest of secrets. The video of that speech, later obtained by local news, would be played and replayed by people trying to reconcile the image of a poised teenage girl with the allegations she would one day face. At the time, though, no one in that church suspected that the killer might be standing just a few feet from the coffins. It was late summer when the quiet in Carrollton broke again. This time, not with sirens, but with an announcement that sent shockwaves through the community. After months of silence, the Carroll County Sheriff's Office called a press conference. Reporters gathered, cameras rolling, as the sheriff stepped up to the podium. The opening lines were direct. "Today we can confirm an arrest has been made in the murders of James and Kristen Brock." There was a pause as if to let the weight of the moment sink in. Then came the name. "The suspect is 17-year-old Sarah Grace Patrick." The room seemed to tighten. Gasps from those in attendance were audible even on the live stream. The sheriff went on to explain that Sarah had been 16 at the time of the killings and was being charged with 2 counts of murder and 2 counts of aggravated assault. Her mugshot was released. The face of a teenager, expression neutral, framed by long hair, now splashed across every local news site. Law enforcement said she had turned herself in after being informed she would be charged. Her biological father had driven her to the sheriff's office. They didn't go into detail about the evidence, only repeating a phrase that reporters would quote again and again: "A mountain of evidence." The public's reaction was immediate and divided. Some refused to believe she could have done it, insisting there had to be a mistake. Others admitted they had always felt something off about her demeanor after the murders. For investigators, the arrest was the culmination of months of patient work. For the community, it was the beginning of a new kind of horror, one where the suspect wasn't a stranger lurking in the shadows, but someone who had sat at the family dinner table, laughed in their living room, and called the victims mom and dad. Before her name became synonymous with the Carrollton double homicide, Sarah Grace Patrick was, to most who knew her, just another teenager navigating high school life. Friends described her as active on social media, quick to post selfies, quotes, and videos, the curated snapshots of youth in the digital age. She had lived a somewhat unsettled childhood, moving between relatives at different points, but in the months before the murders, she was back in the Brock household. Kristen was her mother. James, her stepfather. Outwardly, they functioned like a family, though some who knew them privately hinted that the dynamic could be tense at times. Investigators pieced together her routine in the weeks leading up to February 20th. There were school days, time spent with her boyfriend, and a steady stream of TikTok activity. While most of her online presence was typical teenage content, certain posts, once viewed in the context of the crime, took on an eerie undertone. Sarah's appearance was unremarkable in a way that made the allegations more jarring. She didn't fit the stereotype of a violent offender. She was young, soft-spoken in public, and in pictures, often smiling. But law enforcement knew that outward appearances could be misleading. Her arrest marked her as one of the youngest people in recent Georgia history to face charges for a double murder. At just 17, she was being charged as an adult. A legal decision that meant, if convicted, she could spend the rest of her life behind bars. For the media, Sarah was now both a suspect and a mystery. Who was she behind the curated posts and polished filters? And what could have possibly pushed her to commit an act so calculated, so final, against the people who raised her? If Sarah Grace Patrick's arrest shocked Carrollton, what came next stunned the wider public. As reporters dug into her background, they uncovered a digital trail that was impossible to ignore. Sarah's TikTok account, still public at the time, painted a picture of a grieving daughter, videos of her crying, photos of her with her mom, and captions that read like heartfelt tributes. One post from March 1st, less than 2 weeks after the murders, showed a video montage of James and Kristen with the caption, "They don't know it, but a year from now, me and my 5-year-old sister would find them wrongfully shot dead in our home and won't get to watch me graduate high school, see me walk down the aisle, and couldn't even say goodbye." Another clip, posted March 18th, showed her wiping tears from her face, captioned, "Please send prayers for healing and a break from everything. I'm so tired, I should probably delete later." On Mother's Day in May, Sarah posted a smiling photo with Kristen, captioned, "But my ultimate inspiration comes from my best friend." These posts, taken at face value, seemed like expressions of grief, But investigators saw them differently. To them, it was the alleged killer shaping a narrative, building the image of a heartbroken daughter while, according to police, knowing the truth of what had happened. And it wasn't just the content of her posts that caught their attention. Law enforcement examined timestamps, locations, and phone data to see where she had been and who she had been communicating with during the days before and after the murders. In an age where nearly every action leaves a digital footprint, her online life became as much a part of the investigation as fingerprints and ballistics. To the public, it was hard to reconcile. The same teenager smiling on the beach just weeks before her arrest was now accused of planning and executing one of the most chilling crimes Carrollton had ever seen. When pressed for details about why they were so certain Sarah Grace Patrick was their suspect, the Carroll County Sheriff's Office remained guarded. They wouldn't outline every piece of evidence they had collected, but they repeated one phrase often enough that it became the headline. "Aye, a mountain of evidence." In the press conference announcing her arrest, the sheriff explained that the investigation had been methodical, sifting through hours of interviews, combing digital data, analyzing physical evidence from the scene. They had worked with other law enforcement partners to ensure every lead was pursued, every potential suspect examined. When a reporter asked what shifted the focus onto Sarah, the sheriff replied that in any homicide case, everyone is a suspect in the beginning. But as the weeks wore on, evidence consistently pointed inward, narrowing the possibilities until only one remained. That mountain was likely made up of multiple layers. Ballistic evidence linking a weapon to the scene, forensic analysis that placed Sarah in proximity to the murders, and perhaps even inconsistencies in her statements that investigators could not overlook. Though they didn't confirm specifics, the sheriff hinted that digital records played a key role. The absence of forced entry also weighed heavily. In most break-ins, there's some indication of a struggle or theft. Here, nothing was taken. The victims were shot in their bed, a scenario that strongly suggested the killer had been inside willingly, or was already living there. Police also knew that their suspect had remained in close proximity to the investigation the entire time. Sarah had attended the funeral, posted tributes online, and carried on with daily life. All the while, detectives were quietly collecting the evidence they believed would hold up in court. In the sheriff's words, it was not a sudden breakthrough that led to her arrest. It was the steady accumulation of facts, each one stacking higher, until the case could no longer be ignored. In modern investigations, digital evidence is often as critical as fingerprints or DNA, and in this case, detectives treated Sarah's online life as a potential goldmine of clues. Every TikTok post, private message, and location ping was examined for patterns, not just in the days following the murders, but in the weeks leading up to them. Investigators looked for changes in her tone, sudden emotional shifts, or posts that hinted at underlying resentment or conflict. They dug into her phone records, identifying who she was communicating with before and after February 20th, and whether any conversations suggested foreknowledge or planning. One key area of focus was whether Sarah had spoken to anyone about her relationship with James and Kristen in the days prior. In cases involving a close family member as a suspect, law enforcement often finds traces of motive in texts or DMs, a fight, a rule enforced, a perceived betrayal. The forensic data also had another use: establishing a timeline. Phone location logs could place her in specific rooms at specific times, narrowing down the window of opportunity. If she had been active on her phone during the hours when the murders occurred, investigators could compare that data to physical evidence, for instance, whether she was near the bedroom or the weapon at the time. They also searched for deleted content. Even posts removed from social media can often be recovered by forensic specialists, and those remnants sometimes reveal more than what's left in plain sight. Deleted messages, draft posts, unsent videos, all could be pieces of the puzzle. Motive remained elusive, but the digital trail was filling in the how and when with increasing clarity. It was a slow, meticulous process, but for detectives, every bite of recovered data brought them closer to building a case they could take before a jury, one in which Sarah's own online presence might play a starring role. From the outside, the Brock murders might have seemed straightforward: 2 victims, 1 house, few possible suspects. But investigators knew that domestic homicides often present unique challenges. When a victim and suspect live together, the usual markers of intrusion lose significance. Fingerprints, expected to be everywhere. DNA, completely normal to find on shared objects. Footprints, hair strands, personal items, all of it is part of the natural environment of the home. The real challenge becomes establishing real context. For example, a suspect's fingerprints on a murder weapon are damning, but only if you can prove they were placed there during the crime. If that weapon was kept in the home and accessible, the defense could argue those prints were from an earlier, innocent moment. In the Brock case, the absence of forced entry was both a clue and an obstacle. It strongly suggested the killer was known to the victims, but it also made proving guilt more difficult. Anyone with regular access to the house could have entered without leaving signs of a break-in. Another complication was the victim's state when they were found. Both were still in bed, under blankets. There were no defensive wounds, no sign they had tried to get up or protect themselves. That ruled out self-defense and made a burglary-turned-homicide highly unlikely. But it also meant there was no struggle to yield clear-cut forensic evidence, no skin cells under fingernails, no overturned furniture, no scattered belongings. Investigators had to rely on subtler forms of proof. The trajectory of the bullets, the position of the bodies, residue patterns on bedding and clothing. Each detail could point toward someone standing over the bed, firing at close range, someone the Brocks trusted enough to let into their most vulnerable space. It was this careful layering of physical and circumstantial evidence that would eventually help bridge the gap between suspicion and probable cause. In the weeks after James and Kristen Brock were killed, Sarah Grace Patrick's public life told a story. Just not the one investigators believed was true. She attended her parents' funeral, spoke at the podium, and posted emotional tributes online. In video after video, she portrayed herself as a devastated daughter, struggling to come to terms with an unimaginable loss. Tears streamed down her face in some clips. In others, she smiled through moments with friends, as though clinging to normalcy. To people scrolling through TikTok, it might have seemed like grief in real time. But to detectives, this was the behavior of a person who knew she was under scrutiny, and perhaps was trying to manage the narrative. What stood out most was how quickly Sarah returned to routine life. Just weeks after the murders, she posted beach videos, smiling in the sun, her captions light and casual. There was no mention of the investigation, no indication of fear or uncertainty. For law enforcement, that raised an important question. Was this emotional resilience or detachment? Retired crime scene investigators interviewed on TV pointed out that such behavior isn't unprecedented. Some suspects in past high-profile cases have appeared strangely calm or even cheerful after committing violent crimes, a response experts sometimes attribute to shock, denial, or an attempt to compartmentalize. Still, to the community, the contrast was unsettling. Here was a teenager publicly mourning, yet living life as though the tragedy hadn't happened, a dual reality that became even harder to reconcile once her arrest was announced. Those who had once offered her sympathy were now replaying every post, every smile, every carefully chosen word, searching for signs of the truth they might have missed. Family dynamics can be complicated in any household, but in blended families, tensions sometimes run deeper, invisible to outsiders until they erupt. In the Brock home, James was Sarah Grace Patrick's stepfather, not her biological dad. That fact alone doesn't mean conflict, but it gave investigators reason to look closer at the relationships inside the house. Friends of the family painted different pictures. Some said Sarah seemed distant from James, treating him more like an authority figure than a parental one. Others recalled moments of tension between Sarah and her mother, Kristen, typical teenage clashes over rules, curfews, and relationships. Still, no one reported anything extreme enough to predict violence. But law enforcement had to consider every possibility. Was there an escalating conflict in the home? Had there been a recent argument? Could resentment, jealousy, or feelings of being controlled have boiled over into something deadly? Detectives also looked into whether Sarah's personal life, especially her relationship with her boyfriend, played any role. Had her parents disapproved? Had they tried to limit her contact with him? In other cases, such restrictions have been a trigger for teenagers feeling trapped or misunderstood. And then there was the broader question of motive. People wanted to know why a young woman would allegedly kill the people raising her. Investigators reminded the public that motive isn't legally required to secure a conviction, but they also knew juries crave a reason. Without one, the story feels incomplete, even if the evidence is strong. In the Brock case, no clear motive was publicly announced. But within the sheriff's office, every scrap of information about the family dynamic was being examined, not to excuse the crime, but to understand how a home that appeared loving from the outside could become the scene of such betrayal from within. From the outside, it might have seemed like Sarah Grace Patrick's arrest came out of nowhere. But for investigators, the months between the murders and the public announcement were a necessary stretch of quiet, deliberate work. February turned into March, then April. Detectives continued gathering witness statements, forensic reports, and digital data. They ran down every tip, even ones that seemed unlikely, to ensure no avenue was left unexplored. This wasn't just about finding the killer, it was about building a case strong enough to survive the courtroom. Homicide detectives know the dangers of moving too fast. Arrest someone without enough evidence, and the entire case can crumble, potentially letting a guilty person walk free. So they waited, watching, piecing together their mountain of evidence, one layer at a time. The lack of forced entry, the forensic scene, the timing of the 911 call. All these elements began to fit together. Add in the analysis of Sarah's social media activity and her movements that night, and the picture sharpened. Investigators also needed to eliminate other possible suspects, extended family members, acquaintances, or even a potential intruder, before zeroing in on her as their primary focus. For the community, the wait was frustrating. Some feared the killer might never be caught. Others suspected law enforcement knew more than they were saying. In truth, both were partially correct. The sheriff's office had been keeping a close eye on their suspect for months, but they weren't ready to tip their hand. By the time summer rolled around, the decision was made. The evidence was strong enough. The risk of waiting any longer outweighed the need for further secrecy. Soon, Sarah Grace Patrick would be told she was the target of a double murder investigation, and she would walk into the sheriff's office to face the consequences. Once Sarah Grace Patrick became the prime suspect, investigators shifted into a new phase: surveillance and strategy. The goal wasn't just to keep tabs on her, but to observe her behavior in the weeks before an arrest. According to law enforcement experts, suspects in major crimes are often monitored without their knowledge. This can mean unmarked vehicles parked at a distance, discreet tracking of phone activity, or coordination with local businesses to collect security footage whenever the suspect is in public. In some cases, investigators will even keep indirect contact through friends or acquaintances to gauge mood and potential risk. In Sarah's situation, police knew she wasn't a flight risk. She was still attending school, posting online, and living with relatives. But they also knew that watching her without confrontation could yield valuable insight. Would she visit any location connected to the crime? Would she reach out to someone with knowledge of the murders? Would her social media posts shift if she sensed investigators closing in? The key was patience. By not arresting her immediately, detectives could allow her to live under the illusion that she was still just another grieving family member. Sometimes, suspects slip up during this period. They might discuss the case in too much detail, contradict their earlier statements, or even try to interfere with potential witnesses. When the decision finally came to move forward, the approach was controlled. Sarah wasn't cornered in public or confronted in an aggressive takedown. Instead, law enforcement notified her through official channels that she was about to be charged. Her biological father drove her to the sheriff's office, where she surrendered peacefully. The calm arrest was deceptive in its simplicity. Behind it lay months of strategic observation, a quiet watch that ensured when the time came, there would be no last-minute surprises. Before her arrest, Sarah Grace Patrick was known to classmates and neighbors as a fairly typical teenager. She had a social circle, a boyfriend, and an active online presence. Teachers described her as quiet in class, but engaged when talking about subjects that interested her. Friends remembered her as someone who could be warm in private but guarded in public. Her upbringing hadn't been entirely stable. At different points, she had lived with various relatives, moving between households. But by early 2023, she was living again with her mother, Kristen, stepfather, James, and her younger half-sister in Carrollton. Outwardly, it appeared the family was functioning as many do, with the usual ups and downs of teenage life. Sarah's social media pages were filled with filtered photos, lighthearted captions, and typical teenage humor. But mixed in with these were occasional posts hinting at stress or emotional strain, song lyrics about feeling misunderstood, captions about needing a break, and vague statements about people changing. At the time, these didn't raise alarms. In hindsight, investigators flagged them as potential glimpses into her state of mind before the murders. Classmates who later spoke to reporters expressed shock at the arrest. None could recall her showing signs of aggression, though some admitted she could be distant or dismissive when she didn't want to engage. Others pointed out that social media never tells the whole story. You only see what someone chooses to share. For the prosecution, building a picture of who Sarah was before the crime could be as important as proving what happened on February 20th. Jurors often want to understand the before just as much as the after. And in this case, the gap between the smiling teenager in selfies and the accused killer in a mugshot was one the court would have to reconcile. As Sarah Grace Patrick's case moved toward trial, speculation began about what her defense strategy might be. At just 17 years old, she was legally considered a minor at the time of the murders. But Georgia law allowed prosecutors to charge her as an adult for crimes this severe. That meant the potential consequences were life-altering, possibly even life without parole. Defense attorneys in cases like this often examine every angle that might sway a jury. One avenue could be Sarah's age and brain development. Neurological research shows that the human brain, particularly the prefrontal cortex, the area involved in decision-making, impulse control, and understanding long-term consequences, doesn't fully mature until the mid-20s. The defense could argue that her youth limited her ability to process and respond to conflict in a rational way. Another possible focus might be mental health. If Sarah had a documented history of depression, anxiety, trauma, or other psychiatric conditions, her lawyers could use this to contextualize her alleged actions. This wouldn't erase guilt, but it might be used to argue for leniency in sentencing. There's also the question of motive, or the lack of a publicly stated one. Without a clear motive, the defense could challenge the narrative of premeditation, suggesting that if the killings occurred, they might have been impulsive or triggered by an immediate emotional crisis rather than a calculated plan. Finally, they could scrutinize the evidence itself. Was it truly conclusive? Could digital footprints be misinterpreted? Could forensic evidence have alternate explanations? Even a mountain of evidence can be picked apart if enough doubt is introduced about how it was gathered or analyzed. For now, all of this remains speculative. What's certain is that the defense will have to address the duality at the heart of this case. How a seemingly ordinary teenager could be accused of something so deliberate, so final, against the very people who raised her. The arrest of Sarah Grace Patrick closed one chapter of the Brock family tragedy, but the road ahead is far from over. As the legal process unfolds, the community of Carrollton remains caught between disbelief and the grim reality of the charges. Sarah is being held as an adult, facing 2 counts of murder and 2 counts of aggravated assault. If convicted, she could spend the rest of her life in prison. Court dates will bring new waves of media coverage, each hearing peeling back layers of evidence and testimony that may finally reveal what happened in the Brock home that February night. For the surviving child, now 6 years old, the future is more personal, more fragile. She is living with relatives, shielded as much as possible from the storm swirling around her family's name. Yet her memories of that morning, however fragmented, may linger for a lifetime. The community, too, is left to reconcile its image of a tight-knit, trusting town with the truth that violence can strike anywhere, even behind the most familiar doors. In local conversations, the case has become a touchstone for questions about family relationships, mental health, and the hidden tensions that can exist beneath calm surfaces. Investigators stand by their conclusion, confident in the mountain of evidence they say links Sarah to the crime. The defense will have its chance to challenge every detail, and the jury, when the time comes, will have the final word. Until then, the Brock murders remain more than just a headline. They are a reminder that the most shocking betrayals often come from within, and that sometimes the person you'd least suspect is the one standing closest when the lights go out.
The 911 call was received. A relentless investigation began, one that would span months, consume thousands of man-hours, and require the full weight of the local and federal law enforcement agency partnerships. Today, we can confirm that an arrest has been made in the case. Kristen Brock's 17-year-old daughter, Sarah Grace Patrick, has been taken into custody and charged with 2 counts of murder and 2 counts of aggravated assault in connection with the deaths of her mother and her stepfather.
At what point did investigators begin to focus on her as the suspect?
So I believe in the beginning of any case, everyone's a suspect. I think I told many of you that when we were on scene that day. However, as an investigation continues and everything ebbs and flows, like I said in my press release, mountains of evidence has gotten us through here today. Lots of processing, lots of working with our law enforcement partners to get us to where we are today that honed in on her as a suspect.
Do you believe that she tried to cover this up in any way over the course of these months? You know, we've even seen some videos on social media of somebody saying, you know, I'm making this message on behalf of the daughter. Do you believe she tried to get people to cover up anything?
Considering that she didn't just immediately tell us what happened, yes. But who knows what's going on in a young person's mind like that. But she has been arrested and charged now, and we feel confident that she is responsible for their murders. But like I said, it is an open, ongoing investigation. It's very possible others are involved.